Angus Bernard MacEachern, 1759 to 1835. Missionary priest, pioneer bishop. In his preface to the Catholic Church in Prince Edward Island, 1720 to 1979, editor Michael Hennessy gives an account of his visit to the Memorial Chapel at St. Andrews, dedicated to Bishop Angus Bernard MacEachern.
I contemplated the tablet at the foot of the altar, which reads, "The mortal remains of Bishop Angus B. MacEachern, 1759 to 1835, lie beneath this chapel, and something of the adventurous pioneer spirit of that great man stirred within me. I shut my eyes and ears to the world about me and allowed the brisk southwest wind to carry me back 150 years to the days when that giant among men trod this very pathway, and for a golden moment he touched me, and a shiver of awe passed through me at the magic of the Spirit of God."
It is the hope that this presentation may offer the listener something of the spirit of Angus MacEachern, that giant among men. Much of our knowledge of the life and work of Bishop MacEachern comes from The Early History of the Catholic Church in Prince Edward Island, published in 1905 by Reverend John C. McMillan. The Call. Angus Bernard MacEachern was born at Kinlochmoidart, Scotland on February 8, 1759, the son of Hugh Ban MacEachern and Mary MacDonald. In 1772, his parents and 6 of his siblings, among 210 Scottish settlers, led by Captain John MacDonald of Glenaladale, immigrated to St. John's Island, as this island was then called. 13-year-old Angus Bernard remained in Scotland to study for the priesthood. Catholic schooling for clergy was prohibited in Scotland, so in the fall of 1772, Angus Bernard entered the secret preparatory seminary of Samlaman Moidart. In August 1777, he entered the Royal Scots College in Valladolid, Spain, to complete his classical and theological studies. At the college, Angus Bernard was described as
not a brilliant student, but he possessed a rich fund of sound, practical common sense, which, joined to a scrupulous application to study, enabled him to hold a prominent place in all his classes.
While at the college, he displayed talents for linguistics and carpentry, skills that would serve him well in his missionary career. On August 20th, 1787, Bishop Moreno of Valladolid ordained Angus Bernard to the priesthood. Father MacEachern returned to Scotland, where he served his early ministry in several islands of the Highland District of Scotland. Catholic dioceses and their bishops had been abolished in Scotland at the time of the Reformation. The Church then functioned under titular bishops in provisional territories called apostolic vicariates. By 1727, 2 such vicariates had been set up. One was the Highland District, based in Aberdeen, where Father MacEachern served. Many of his parishioners in the Highland Districts were related to the families that had gone with the Glenaladale settlers to the island in 1772. Some of Father MacEachern's parishioners were determined to join their people on the island, and they were already developing a new immigration plan. In response to their repeated appeals, as well as to the constant entreaties from his own family on the island, Father MacEachern approached his bishop, Right Reverend Alexander MacDonald, for permission to transfer from the Scottish missions to serve the Scots on the island. Bishop MacDonald reluctantly agreed to the request and sent a testimonial letter on behalf of Father MacEachern to Bishop Jean-François Hubert of the Diocese of Quebec, which at the time included the maritime colonies. In August 1790, with some 250 Scottish Catholics, Father Angus Bernard MacEachern arrived on the island. He was warmly welcomed by his fellow Scots and made his first home at Canavoy, where his parents had settled. The arrival of Father MacEachern proved to be a pivotal event in the history of the Roman Catholic Church on PEI. Inscription on cairn in Canavoy. On this site was the home of Hugh Ban MacEachern, his wife, and 6 of their 8 children, who emigrated from Kinlochmoidart, Scotland, to Savage Harbour in 1772, along with the Glenaladale settlers. They were joined in 1790 by their youngest son, Father Angus Bernard MacEachern, 1759 to 1835. The following year, he built a stone house with chapel, where he lived for many years with his parents. The nascent church of slightly more than 1,000 souls from the Mi'kmaq, Acadian, and Scottish populations was spread across the island. They had been without a resident priest since 1785, and their only places of worship were two crude structures reconstructed from the remnants of churches that had been abandoned at the fall of the French regime. Father MacEachern wrote to Bishop Hubert of Quebec requesting permission to undertake priestly duties among the Scottish immigrants on the island. He received permission to minister not only to his native Scots in the eastern part of the island, but also to the Acadians who were settled as far west as Malpeque. Soon, Father MacEachern would learn that his parish would include the whole of the island, as well as the Magdalene Islands, Cape Breton Island, and the Northumberland shore of Nova Scotia. An additional challenge facing Father MacEachern was the variety of languages found in the different communities. The geographer Andrew Hill Clark, in his book 3 Centuries and the Island, shows the distribution of the island population and languages spoken in 1798. Of course, he only included the peoples of European descent. Thus, Father MacEachern would be called upon to use his linguistic talents as he worked in Gaelic with his native Scots, in French among the Acadians, and in English for the few Anglo-Saxon Catholics and the newly arrived Irish. A charming story is recounted of MacEachern engaging in the games with Acadian children so he could become more fluent in their language. The missionary priest. For the next 32 years, often as the only priest in the area, Father MacEachern attended to his culturally diverse and geographically scattered flock. Over this vast area separated by wide stretches of water and trackless terrain between scattered settlements, in all seasons of weather, he followed his call to service.
When we go by the woods, which is generally the case, we go from 10 to 40 miles without meeting a settlement, sometimes guided by a blaze, and often on snowshoes. No human being can answer the different calls, especially in wintertime, when no human can face a northwest wind.
But even as he faced hardships in his travels, MacEachern was thoughtful of others who would be in the same situation. In his 1875 History of Prince Edward Island, one of the earliest published histories of the island, Duncan Campbell noted,
He, MacEachern, was in the habit of hanging up buckets near the springs by the roadside in order to enable travelers to water their horses on their journeys. The same benevolence permeated all his actions, and his hospitality was unbounded.
Father Macmillan observed that in winter, Father MacEachern made use of snowshoes and skates. Otherwise, he walked and later he rode by horseback or by a two-wheeled vehicle known as his yellow gig. Father Macmillan noted,
When the snow lay deep on the ground, the gig yielded its place to a sleigh of rude construction, a sort of Mongol contrivance, half boat and half sleigh.
It was a vehicle of his own design and construction which allowed Father MacEachern to navigate the smaller bodies of water and to cross the snow-covered terrain.
Its lower part was composed of runners and crossbars, like the ordinary sleigh. Upon this was placed a boat about 8 feet in length, which he fastened with light iron stays to the framework underneath.
The unusual vehicle worked very well.
If the horse should happen to break through the ice, the boat would float on the surface of the water and thus prevent his luggage from being lost or injured by the wet.
This vehicle survives and may be seen on display along with MacEachern's snowshoes and carrying case in St. Dunstan's Basilica, the cathedral in Charlottetown. Thus, Father MacEachern made his way by all manner of travel between the widespread settlements, carrying with him the altar stone, missal, sacred vessels, bread, wine, and vestments necessary to his ministry. The sacred vessels and implements required for the administration of the sacraments were very meager in the pioneer church. Macmillan noted the situation at the outset of Father MacEachern's tenure.
In the whole territory, there was only one chalice, 2 or 3 old worn missals, and a few vestments, worn almost to rags by being continually carried about from place to place.
MacEachern's personal appearance was just as unpretentious. As Macmillan noted,
He made as little outward display of his clerical character as was consistent with his calling.
This was not a new condition for him. In Scotland, where priests were looked upon with suspicion, if not actually outlawed, they had adopted this manner of dress in order to avoid confrontation. Father MacEachern simply continued the custom in his new home. His manner of dress also reflected the reality of a struggling pioneer community. Father MacEachern wore clothing that any layman would wear. According to Father Macmillan,
Father MacEachern's clothes were usually of dark homespun cloth woven by one of his sisters-in-law and fulled by an old-fashioned process long since gone out of date.
Nor was Father MacEachern any more fastidious in his sleeping arrangements. Macmillan recorded,
Some of the older people in the northeastern parts of Prince Edward Island tell how he often improvised a bed on the floor when driven by stress of weather to take shelter in a cottage when there was no accommodation for his reception. With a bundle of straw from the barn and the furs from his sleigh, he would arrange a comfortable shakedown before the open fireplace, and there pass the night in calm repose.
A priest's easy connection with his flock is very much an ideal promoted by Pope Francis. In March 2013, a few weeks after his election as pontiff, he addressed priests at the Chrism Mass at St. Peter's.
This I ask of you, be shepherds with the odor of the sheep. Make it real as shepherds among your flock.
Father MacEachern had put that ideal into practice 2 centuries earlier. When he arrived at each destination, Father MacEachern set himself up in a private home to conduct his station. There he would hold confessions, say Mass, perform baptisms, bless marriages, and offer the consolation of the sacraments of the sick to the afflicted and the elderly. And he did not restrict himself to Catholics only. He made himself available to serve all people and all religious denominations. The historical sketch of the East Point Baptist Church, Prince Edward Island, Canada, reports,
Until about 1823, the people of West River, or Kingsborough, took their children over to Bishop MacEachern, who lived at St. Andrews, to have them sprinkled or christened.
He instructed his people in their religion, and because he was usually the most educated among the rural inhabitants, he was frequently called upon for advice in legal issues, farming and fishing practices, financial matters, and medical concerns. As noted by Duncan Campbell,
Among his Catholic flock, he was at once pastor and judge. He decided differences, he settled disputes, and his verdict was, in almost every case, gracefully acquiesced in.
there are many accounts of MacEachern's providing medical assistance, and one of the most enduring stories relates to his use of a cancer cure. C.C. Pratt, in A Brief History of St. Peter's Bay, no date given, relates the account of this cancer treatment given to Pratt's own grandmother when she was a young girl.
When this little girl was 9 years old, she developed a cancer in the tongue. Her father took her on horseback through wood trails to St. Andrews, where Bishop MacEachern was reputed to have a miraculous cure for the otherwise fatal malady. The bishop put the plaster, which contained some poisonous acid, on her tongue and shaped a hardwood clip with a little handle, and he and his sister, who kept house for him, held this clip in the back of the little girl's tongue when she had to have sleep for 6 long weeks when the cancer came out clean.
And having brought to members of his own flock the benefits of their church, he would continue his journey to the next mission, striving to achieve the impossibility of ready service to all.
Our people die without the sacraments, and we cannot help it. If a clergyman can hear the confessions of his people once a year, in even a cursory way, he does a great deal. And as for instruction, it is out of the question. Let his intention be ever so good, or his abilities ever so great. I have gone 80 and often 90 miles to see sick people, and while we are running to one, another dies in our rear, calling for spiritual assistance, and none, perhaps within 150 miles of him.
This makeshift arrangement did not promote the development of a flourishing church community, so Father MacEachern turned his attention to the problem. As early as 1794, a property known as St. Andrew's Farm had been purchased where a church, parochial house, and a school for preparing men for the priesthood could be established. The site at St. Andrews, where Father MacEachern served as resident pastor, and from where he conducted his ministry journeys around the region, became the headquarters of the Catholic Church in the Eastern Maritimes. In 1803, Peter Deneau, the Bishop of Quebec, made a tour of his maritime missions. He was appalled at the conditions under which the liturgical services were offered on the island. He issued several directives, including a request for the Catholics of the eastern part of the island to construct and properly furnish a new chapel at St. Andrews. The church was constructed under the supervision of Father MacEachern, and by 1805, the first church at St. Andrews was opened. While it was quite an achievement to erect suitable places of worship in the impoverished colony, the need for priests was an even more urgent problem for the faithful. Since his arrival on the island in 1790, Father MacEachern had usually been the only priest to serve the growing population. From time to time, visiting clerics had provided some temporary assistance. In 1799, Fathers de Cologne and Picard, émigrés from the Revolution in France, arrived on the island. They were of great assistance in serving the Acadian population and the growing community in Charlottetown, but by 1804, both priests had left for other assignments. Meanwhile, the arrival in 1802 of Father Alexander MacDonald, who took up residence in Arisig, relieved Father MacEachern of tending to the flock on the Gulf shore of Nova Scotia. In 1803, Father Augustine MacDonald, the brother of Captain John MacDonald of Glenaladale, arrived on the island to spend his last years in the comfort of his own family. He was also able to offer ministerial support to the beleaguered Father MacEachern. Later, between 1812 and 1822, Father Jean-Louis Beaubien and Father Joseph Etienne Cécile from Quebec came to minister to the Acadian population. However, for the most part, Father MacEachern was the only priest available to serve the people of PEI. In spite of repeated appeals to bishops in Quebec and in Europe, there seemed little hope of attracting additional clergy. Bishop Deneau's visit may have led to improvements in the organization of the church on the island, and to reforms in liturgical practice, but did little to remedy the most pressing problem, the need for more priests. In 1812, the island was again visited by its bishop. This time, it was Right Reverend Joseph Octave Plessis. Once again, a Quebec-based prelate coming from an environment where the church had enjoyed a position of prominence for over 2 centuries, was scandalized by the primitive conditions in this part of his diocese. The bishop observed,
"Here you find a chalice with a cup of gilded copper, there one entirely of tin. In most of churches there are neither cruets, nor albs, nor chalices, nor altar cloths, nor credence tables, nor surplices, nor holy water fonts, nor baptismal water. In the whole of Prince Edward Island, neither censer nor ostensorium has been seen within the memory of man."
He also commented on the appearance of Father MacEachern and noted,
"A Scotch priest will preach, hear confessions, and administer all the sacraments dressed in citizen's clothing, with an old ribbon that serves for a stole suspended from his neck. In bringing Holy Communion to the sick, he puts this ragged stole in one pocket and the pyx containing the sacred host in another."
In a pastoral letter penned while visiting in Bay Fortune, the bishop
enjoined on Father MacEachern the obligation of wearing a clerical dress as prescribed by the Council of Trent.
Father MacEachern obediently followed his bishop's directive. In November 1812, Father MacEachern reported,
"I got my uniform and assisted publicly in my clerical habit at the funeral obsequies of Mr. McPhee with Governor Fanning and several others of our noblesse in Charlottetown."
Bishop Plessis had noted that there was no church to serve the people of the colonial capital. In Charlottetown, Mass was celebrated in various venues in the town. A favorite location was the home of that same Donald McPhee on Dorchester Street. Seeing this as an undesirable situation, the bishop directed that a church be erected in the capital, and possibly in tribute to the civil establishment of the colony, placed it under the patronage of the English saint, Dunstan of Canterbury. It took a while to carry out the bishop's directives, but by 1815, property on the corner of Great George and Sydney Streets had been purchased. and by 1816, the first church of St. Dunstan's had been opened. That simple wooden church stood on the site of the current Gothic basilica. In recognition of the need for additional priests to serve the island flock, the bishop offered space in his seminaries for selected island boys. Their fees were to be paid by the island church, but, at least under this arrangement, there was now a possibility of providing priests from among the island people. And the bishop's offer of places in the Quebec seminary bore fruit. Under this arrangement, 2 island boys eventually returned to the island as priests. Thus ended Father MacEachern's lonely service as the only permanent resident priest. It was during Bishop Plessis' visit that Father MacEachern learned of a treatment for cancer that had proved effective in Quebec. The bishop provided a recipe for the material used, which had become known as the cancer plaster. On March 31, 1815, Father MacEachern reported back to the bishop,
"I have cured 3 persons of cancer by the violent remedy."
The pioneer bishop. The continued development of British North America and an increase in the Catholic population there led to a reorganization of the Diocese of Quebec. Outlying regions of the diocese were placed under the mandate of auxiliary bishops, who served as vicars general to the Archbishop of Quebec. Angus Bernard MacEachern was one of them. In 1819, he was given the title of titular Bishop of Rosen, and, in addition to his customary assignment, was given responsibility for the territory of New Brunswick. The extended region proved a challenge even for the intrepid MacEachern, as he would reveal in a later correspondence.
"I traveled above 400 miles in Nova Scotia, past then across the Bay of Fundy to St. John's, the then capital of New Brunswick. After confirming all that were prepared for the sacrament, I went by sea to Moose Island, 60 miles distant, from that to St. Andrews, opposite the American lines, then up the river 90 miles to the Indian village, and back to Fredericton 14 miles, across through the woods 45 miles to a branch of the Miramichi River, and down the said river and rapids in a canoe 70-odd miles."
But the role of bishop offered MacEachern the privilege of ordaining some of the first priests from the Maritimes. William MacLeod and John Chisholm from Nova Scotia, and Sylvain Perry from Tignish, the first islander and first Acadian to be ordained on the island. These ordinations took place at his humble church at St. Andrews. While these ordinations were most welcome, the need to provide for a consistent supply of priestly vocations continued. It was clear to the newly established bishop that, while his region of service and his scope of responsibility were expanded, he had no more power to advance the proposed seminary for the region. Even the allocation in 1826 of 2 free spaces for island students at the College of the Sacred Congregation of Propaganda in Rome, while most welcome, would not meet the increasing need for priests to serve the people in the developing parishes. In spite of the progress that had been made, the need for priests continued among the growing population of Catholics. MacEachern often felt he did not receive the necessary support from the diocesan leadership. His requests for priests, especially to serve the Acadian population, generally went unanswered, as did his appeals to the well-established church in Quebec for financial support for his sprawling missions. But Bishop Plessis had already stated his position rather bluntly.
"With respect to Prince Edward Island, I do not see any other resources other than those you can draw from on the island itself."
MacEachern's frustration was expressed with equal bluntness.
"What has Canada ever done for this island since the conquest? What provision for the Acadians in spirituals before our people arrived on the island? And what has been done for us since?"
Obviously, the pastoral needs of the island church would have to rely on the resources of its own people, a situation anticipated as early as 1794, when St. Andrew's Farm had been acquired with a view to establish a school that might prepare local youth to respond to a priestly vocation. 30 years later, the situation had become even more dire, and the proposed school at St. Andrews took on a new urgency. The school at St. Andrews, which could be supported locally, would offer pre-seminary training and was seen as an answer to the problem. Unfortunately, the hard-worked MacEachern and the financially strapped islanders were unable to proceed quickly with the project. In 1829, after a 10-year campaign with church officials in Quebec and Rome, MacEachern's territory was separated from the Archdiocese of Quebec and established as the Diocese of Charlottetown, incorporating Prince Edward Island, the Magdalene Islands, and New Brunswick. Angus Bernard MacEachern, 39 years after his arrival on the island and at age 70, was named the first Bishop of Charlottetown. With increased authority and an expanded source of revenue, MacEachern's dream of a school to prepare young Catholic men for the priesthood and for the lay professions could finally take place. On November 30th, 1831, having acquired a suitable teaching staff, he opened St. Andrew's College in the rectory at St. Andrew's Farm. The school, the first institution of secondary education on the island, was incorporated by an act of the PEI legislature in 1833. 4 years after the opening of his college, the arduous earthly journey of Angus Bernard MacEachern came to an end. In the spring of 1835, while conducting a mission at St. Peter's Bay, he suffered a stroke. He was taken to his home at Savage Harbor, where he died on April 22nd at the age of 76. His funeral was held in the church that he had built at St. Andrew's, and his remains were interred under the sanctuary of that church. His remains now rest in the memorial chapel near the site of his college, on the old farm he acquired in 1794, and where the Diocese of Charlottetown has its roots. The MacEachern Legacy. Angus Bernard MacEachern, whose ministry to the people of PEI spanned from his arrival on the island in 1790 to his death in 1835, is rightly recognized as one of the major contributors to the development of this island colony. His impact extended beyond his own denomination and into the life of the wider community. The Royal Gazette of April 28, 1835, recorded his death and offered an impressive tribute, noting that MacEachern was
beloved, respected, and esteemed not only by those of his own persuasion, but by every member of the community.
Conscious of his calling to serve all God's people, Bishop MacEachern was always willing to give spiritual assistance and hospitality when requested, regardless of church affiliation. This was a benefit much appreciated and acknowledged. In 1933, Reverend J.A. Ford and Reverend H.G. Mellick, in the historical sketch of the East Point Baptist Church, Prince Edward Island, Canada, provide the interesting account of an encounter with Bishop MacEachern of two women from the East Point area who were going to Three Rivers to obtain a preacher to serve their community.
The next day, they followed the trail along the north side of the island till they arrived at St. Andrews, where they spent the night at the hospitable home of Bishop MacEachern, a kindly and broad-minded Roman Catholic prelate known among all classes and creeds for his Christian courtesy and unstinted hospitability.
The ecumenical spirit of Bishop MacEachern had already been noted. In 1904, Reverend John MacLeod, in his History of Presbyterianism on Prince Edward Island, reported,
Bishop MacEachern of the Roman Catholic Church was said to have been a man of truly Christian spirits and to have been respected and beloved by all. Not a few of the Presbyterians and other Protestant parents received baptism for their children at the hands of the good bishop.
At a time often plagued with communal intolerance, Angus MacEachern provided a model of cooperation and achieved generally cordial relations with the civil authorities. The warm relations with the colonial administration is shown by their willingness to employ him as road inspector and as justice of the peace. In 1825, the Legislative Assembly voted an annual pension of £50 to Bishop MacEachern for meritorious service. This example of good citizenship showed that Roman Catholics were neither disloyal nor a threat to the civil authority. In 1830, Catholics were extended full rights of citizenship with the passing of the Catholic Emancipation Act, which gave them the right to vote on PEI. In 1970, the National Historic Sites and Monuments Board of Canada acknowledged these exceptional achievements by erecting a monument at St. Andrews recognizing Bishop Angus Bernard MacEachern as a distinguished ecclesiastical and civil leader. However, the most obvious legacy of Angus Bernard MacEachern is the Catholic Church on PEI. Nourished by his faithful ministry, the island church became a fruitful vineyard and, under his vigilant leadership, the Diocese of Charlottetown was firmly established. When he arrived in 1790, only the remnants of 2 crude places of worship remained on the island. When he died in 1835, 18 churches had been erected. The small Catholic population of 1790, scattered in small settlements around the island, took root as communities of faith that grew into the strong parish network that covers the island today. Early churches since 1805: Tignish, Cascampeck, Indian River, South Rustico, Cove Head, St. Andrews, St. Margaret's, East Point, Rollo Bay, Launching, Panmure Island, Vernon River, Charlottetown, 7 Mile Bay, Miscouche, Mount Carmel, Egmont Bay, Grand River. Angus Bernard MacEachern's vision, persistence, and example led to a flowering of priestly vocations among the island church. His College of St. Andrews, in its brief span of 13 years, helped train 24 priests. 6 were island-born priests who ministered to the faithful from Tignish to East Point, even into the 20th century, one of whom, Peter McIntyre, became the 3rd Bishop of Charlottetown. St. Andrews was the model for St. Dunstan's University, which opened in Charlottetown in 1855. For over a century, St. Dunstan's provided an educational and spiritual foundation for young men to answer the call to priestly service. It supplied the island with a succession of faithful priests and sent clergy throughout North America, and St. Dunstan's, like St. Andrews, prepared dedicated lay people to fill the ranks of professional men and women to serve the people of Prince Edward Island. Angus Bernard MacEachern's enduring legacy is the fruit of his selfless response to the call of his vocation. In pursuing that call, he overcame the bounds of geography and challenged the constraints of social and economic deprivation. His 48-year service as a faithful priest, first in his native Scotland and continuing for 45 years in ministry to the people of the Maritimes, was always in response to the call of the Master. The willing servant.
Then I heard the voice of the Lord saying, "Whom shall I send? Who will be our messenger?" I answered, "Here I am, send me."
Angus Bernard MacEachern, 1759 to 1835. Missionary priest, pioneer bishop. Prepared by the Friends of St. Andrews. The Friends of St. Andrews was formed in 1988 to reconstruct St. Andrew's Chapel as a memorial to the late Bishop Angus Bernard MacEachern and to the early settlers of Prince Edward Island. Its mandate calls them to promote in any way knowledge of the life, work, and legacy of Bishop Angus Bernard MacEachern. This presentation is made to honor that mandate.